Another area that came to my attention through something I was reading this morning was about higher rate stamp duty land tax and whether you can actually avoid it. Now, there is a circumstance where you can avoid higher rate stamp duty land tax, and this is the case. So I'm going to go through the case and how I interpreted the case and what you should be doing if you wish to follow this piece of case law. When is the higher rate charge not payable? This slide deck or this presentation centres around the case of PM Brewery Limited versus HMRC 2019, which was a case that went through the first tier tax tribunal in February 2019. So the background to the case was probably very similar to many of us involved in property and property development. The background was they purchased a property in 2017, January. The purchase price was $200,000, which clearly qualifies for stamp duty, and they purchased it through a limited entity called P&M Brewery Limited, which was a company that Paul and Nikki Brewery set up for the purpose. Now, clearly, this is a limited entity and therefore qualifies for stamp duty land tax at the higher rate. P&L Brewery Limited returned a stamp duty land tax return, SDLT 01, and calculated the stamp tax due at the standard rate despite the purchase being through a limited vehicle. Okay, that's the background. The basis of the argument was at the point of stamp duty land tax becoming chargeable, the property was not capable of being used as a dwelling. So basically what they argued here was the point of chargeability is the point that you purchase or become the owner of the property. At that point, you could not occupy this property because it was not fit for purpose. That is what they are saying by that statement. So, but clearly under the provisions of the Finance Act 2016, residential property purchased in this way should have been charged at the relevant stamp duty tax rate plus 3%. The case centres around the term dwelling. Now, the term dwelling is actually defined in the Finance Act 2003. And it makes several references, but this is the important part of the Finance Act 2003, which was used in this case to define if the dwelling was fit for purpose. So the building or part of the building counts as a dwelling if it is used or suitable for use as a single dwelling, or it is in the process of being constructed or adapted for such use. So what they're saying is at the point you purchase the property, either somebody is living in that property and using it as a dwelling, or if they're not living in the property, it is still suitable to be occupied as a dwelling. That's the first part. The second part says, if you buy something that is in the process of being constructed, as in you buy something off plan, it is in the process of being constructed to form a dwelling. Or you buy something, for argument's sake, you've gone and bought another property where a contractor is in the process of adapting that property from some other use to being used as a dwelling. The key point is, at the point of purchase, what these conditions have to exist. Okay. There was then a case, quite a few years later, a case against Carson Contractors Limited versus HMRC 2015. Now, this actually was a VAT case, but the definition transcends. So in this case, the definition of a dwelling was defined as a dwelling will, as a minimum, contain facilities for personal hygiene, the consumption of food and drink, the storage of personal belongings, and a place for an individual to rest and sleep. Now that is an actual quote from that particular case. So what they're saying is you need to be able to occupy, you need to be able to cook, you need to be able to, there needs to be some sort of bathroom facilities, there needs to be running water to the site, not necessarily electricity and gas, because you don't necessarily need those. The storage of personal belongings implies that the dwelling is secure and a place for an individual to rest and sleep. So there must be somewhere where you can actually rest and sleep. So that's what this sort of case was defining, was what do we think a dwelling is defined in law. So when we come to the arguments about whether the property that was purchased was a dwelling. Now, I haven't put it in the slide deck, but the property itself was riddled with asbestos and was going to be demolished, and they were going to put a new building on the site. That was the intention. However, no contracts had been signed at that point to do the demolition, and you wouldn't want to occupy a property that was full of asbestos, so it doesn't meet the minimum standards. You couldn't occupy it. So at the point of acquisition, when SDLT became chargeable, the building could not be used as a dwelling, determined by the Carson case. Therefore, it failed the test is used or suitable for use as outlined in the Finance Act 2003. The second part of that test was also not satisfied. The building was not able to meet the second part because it was not being constructed or adapted for such use. They hadn't signed any contracts. They hadn't got any demolition engaged to actually knock it down and rebuild it. This was purely an acquisition of the building for the future project. So again, while it was the brewery's intention to demolish the building and put a new building in its place, that work had not commenced. Therefore, it didn't satisfy the second part of the test. So the tribunal itself upheld the brewery's contention that the building could not be used as a dwelling and therefore was not subject to the higher rate of stamp duty land tax. Still subject to the lower rate of stamp duty land tax because that has a slightly different definition. This is how they drafted the law, but they changed the definition slightly between the higher rate drafting and the standard drafting. So, what does this mean for you? Well, personally, if you purchase a property that cannot be used as a dwelling at the point of purchase, and you need to undertake significant improvements post-purchase, then the way I read this piece of case law is your purchase will only be subject to the standard rate of stamp duty land tax. Now, you probably want to consult your solicitor at this point just to make sure that you've crossed the I's and dotted the T's. But if you roll back through this video, you can see the two principal tests that you need to be able to comply with. If your property does not comply with those two principal tests, it does not constitute a dwelling in terms of the requirements to pay higher rate stamp duty and land tax, and therefore you should only be paying standard rates. Now, before you go and do any of this, my opinion is that you should engage your solicitor, whoever is doing your conveyancing, and just make sure they are aware of this particular case and how this case potentially applies to your purchase. Make sure they are on board with it, otherwise you could run into some sticky water with the Inland Revenue at some point. But that is clearly how the case is outlined, or how I read the case, and therefore if you want to go down this route, do your own research, get your own professionals involved, but it definitely seems to be a valid route at the moment which HMRC have accepted. Remember, the contents of the video you've just watched does not constitute advice. It's my opinion and my reading of the subject matter that I've been discussing. If you like what you heard, of course, feel free to subscribe. Somewhere, either here or here, will be a subscription button. Click the subscription button and you'll be notified when videos are posted to the channel. Somewhere here or here will also be recent videos from the channel and maybe other videos relating to this subject matter. I look forward to you subscribing and joining me on my journey and your journey as an accidental landlord.